And today we are very honored to have with us Dr. Albert González, who is the Associate Professor of Anthropology and Director of C.E. Smith Museum of Anthropology at California State University. And he has also carried out a good deal of ethnohistoric work in relation to Seminole Indian diet here in South Florida. So that being said, he will be presenting his lecture titled Excavating Latinidad, Archaeologies and Material Cultures of Latinx in the United States. And please feel free to ask any questions on the chat, but know that at the end, Albert will be available to ask any questions you may have. So the floor is all yours, Albert. Thank you so much for being here.
Sure thing. Since I'm using my older laptop right now, I can't see the chat at the same time. I can only see my presentation. So if there's something pressing, let me know, and I'll be happy to answer any questions right away, or we can just take questions at the end. So anyways, yeah, I'm Albert González. Que lo que mi gente. It is good to see some Floridians in the house. That's great. I assume that most of you Floridians, I have deep and meaningful connections to Florida, family, and in terms of research. Two, I am a Dominican, Argentinian. That does matter for this talk, but I do identify primarily as Latinx. I'm a Black and Indigenous heritage, and I like to mention this in all my talks because it is important to me, and it should be important to listeners and readers, is that I'm a formerly incarcerated high school dropout. I was born in Queens, New York City. I was raised in Texas. I currently live in California, but that's only via Florida and New Mexico, where I also spent years altogether living in both those places too. So I've had a pretty wide smattering of experience with Latinx folks across the U.S. And like I said, I grew up in Texas as a Dominican Argentinian, which is kind of a weird place to be in life, because I was surrounded swimming in Mexican Americans. I almost never met a Dominican in Dallas, Texas, where I grew up. So I identify as Latinx. My kids are Dominican, Argentinian, and Mexican. And if you're kind of seeing the future of Latinidad, you probably are right. You're probably onto something. For most of us Latinx folks in the United States, our kids will not be just what we are in the future. And that's what this talk is about, is preparing for our Latinx future. In the future, we won't just be Ecuadorian, we won't just be Mexican, we won't just be Boricua, we will be Latinx in one way or another, or Latine, if you prefer it. Right. So what you see in front of you here on the screen is my presentation. This is what I sort of swim in and day out. I go to bed, and these are the things that I dream about. I won't tell you too much about these right now, except to say that they're artifacts and architecture that's really important to this talk, and really important to my mind to understanding Latinidad across the United States, right? So you see an old adobe structure here on the left. Hopefully you can see my mouse pointer. I can put on my screen pointer, but it might slow me down a little bit because I'm using this old computer. So that's an old adobe structure that we'll talk about a little bit. It's in California. This is a machine part that's part of a whiskey distillery that was run by a coalition of Latinx and indigenous folks. These are materials, these couple of things, this a statuette of Shango, the Yoruban god Shango, and this kind of fragrance that has a particular magical purpose are both items that you find in botanicas in South Florida, as well as in California and across the country. And beneath that is an adobe oven. How I'm going to fit this all together under the theme of Latinidad and Latinx material culture, and all in less than 45 minutes, I don't even know, but I'm going to try. So these are the things that I'm going to talk about today. Before I get to them, I want to just quick note about Latinx and Latine. There's been a lot of conversation these days about the difference between Latinx and Latine. And I personally, I have feelings, as Natalie and I have talked about. I have feelings about this. My sense, and I can talk about this in Q&A afterwards in more detail if you like, is that I feel very strongly that Latinx folks in the United States ought to be called what we want to be called, which appears to be primarily Latinx, although that's changing, and that folks in Latin America, if they want to be called Latina, if that better fits their language, then they ought to be called that. That might drive a wedge between us in terms of nomenclature, in terms of terminology, but I think that's okay. There's already differences between us. Latinx folks aren't the same as Latin American folks. That's the first thing. The second thing is that we have to keep in mind that as Latinx folks in the United States, right, who are residing here currently and fall under what I'll call my definition of American Latinidad, that our people, our gente, our family in Latin America I think it's important to make a distinction between them being our cousins, because they're our cousins, right? As opposed to our ancestors, which they're not. We share an ancestry, and we ought to be reverent of that ancestry, particularly indigenous and African ancestry, which are typically not centered, but they're not our ancestors, right? I love my Latin American people, but they don't hold, to my mind, linguistic authority over this term, over Latinidad. And the reason that I mention that is because Spanish is a colonial language, right? I have very little interest in working to preserve a colonial language, and that is hugely controversial. I realize that everybody I talk to about this just loses their minds, when I mention it for the most part. And not that they didn't lose their minds, so that was okay. But most folks kind of don't want to say that. So I'll keep moving forward though. So one of the topics that I'm going to be talking about today is what I call the imagined Latinx community. I'll define our community to the best of my ability for archaeological and material culture studies purposes, right? One of those topics, I'm going to be presenting a number of case studies, to really short versions of these otherwise very thorough case studies of Victorian Latinidad in 19th century Oakland, California, where there's a wealthy Latinx elite that lorded over an indigenous and only partially Latinx group of poor folks, and Latin experimental archaeology, which is the X comes in pretty handy, in terms of archaeological terminology there, where I talk about these adobe ovens that I make that are constructed of these tiny little adobe bricks. If you can see in my own picture here, my own video, there's a little adobe brick I had in my hand there that we make in my lab. I'll talk a little bit about my NSF-funded work in New Mexico, which is about whiskey and war and Latinx and indigenous folks working together against American occupation. And then finally, I'll talk about botanicas, my research in botanicas in Florida and Northern California. It's a kind of combined project with a museum research output. And I call what folks do, practitioners, spiritual practitioners do in these places. They call them trabajos, but I think there's otro trabajo, another type of work. Trabajo means work, right? A labor. There's another type of work that they do there in terms of inter-ethnic braiding of cultures that otherwise haven't been in contact until they arrive in the United States. It's occurring at these botanicas. And most people working there, and most people that walk into these places aren't really aware of them. That's based on my conversation with practitioners and people that frequent these shops. And then finally, we'll real quickly talk about future directions, the Latinx back dirt, the future directions of this research. Okay, so let's talk about how people imagine the Latinx community from the outside, and in the United States in particular, right? From the outside, but also many of us in the inside tend to feel this way, which I find especially interesting when people on the inside do, that we are the American manifestation, the North American manifestation of the Iberian diaspora, that we're somehow only or primarily the descendants of Spaniards and Portuguese who colonized the Americas, right? Or at least that were culturally dominated by that element, that we're culturally homogenous. Obviously, I disagree, right, with that. That we're culturally homogenous, right? That we bring, Black, indigenous, and European worlds together and blend them beautifully. And in addition to that, we're fully colorblind, right? That we don't see color, we don't see race. And if you're Latinx and this sounds ridiculous to you, it's because it is, right? We're not the Iberian diaspora. That's partially what we represent, but it might be minimally what we represent, I'll argue. We are not culturally homogenous at all, right? If you take someone who's Puerto Rican and born and raised in San Juan, their life is going to be very, very different than a Mexican American who's born and raised in East Los Angeles. Even their dialects, English and Spanish, will be difficult for each other to decipher, right? We're very, very different peoples. So why would anyone put us together in this idea of Latinx community? In fact, I'll argue that for the most part, Latinx community as we understand it is mostly not real. How can I say that when I'm writing a book on this? How can I say that when I do this research? I'll help you see. So another thing that from the outside and to some degree from the inside, I think people imagine that we're this perfect blend of whiteness, indigeneity, and blackness, and it's an extended version of the notion of la raza cósmica, and that's a Mexican intellectual, activist and academic idea that we are the blend of the best of whiteness, the best of indigeneity, the best of blackness, and really what that ends up meaning is that we're a blending of the whitest indigeneity and the whitest blackness, and also white Europeans, right? That's what it tends to mean. Obviously, I don't believe any of this, but you see in these images below, these are images of very popular and well-known Latinx folks. The one thing that is true here is that we are all just profoundly attractive, right? And I'm a scientist, so it must be true that it's based on real research. So back to normal people. This is me and my family. Those are my kids several years back. This is my wife, Ariel, who's very light-skinned compared to me, although it may not come across in this image. Very light-skinned compared to me, but is the great-granddaughter of the Mexican general Pancho Villa. So it's about as Mexican as a person can get. My kids are Argentinian, Dominican, and Mexican. So they're Latinx. They're never going to say that to anybody. They're always going to say Latinx. So what does Latinx mean? I argue that Latinx is in some places and should be a coalition, right? Not only in terms politically, not only in terms of culture, but also in terms of anthropological or archaeological analysis, that we should be thinking in terms of coalition, right? We have lots and lots in common, and I break it down here, and these are real and meaningful things that we can draw folks together on. Now, the easy stuff, the stuff that nobody's going to disagree on, I think, Latinx folks are people of Latin American birth or descent, residing currently in the U.S. Sometimes we leave the U.S. But think about what happens when we leave the U.S. Those of you who've been in the States for a couple of decades or more, or those of you who were born here and lived your whole life here, when you go back to the homeland, what do they call you? From Tierra del Fuego to Tijuana, they call you a gringo, or maybe we should say gringex now, right? Or gringue. A gringo in Mexico and Central America, a pocho, all those things, right? Another reason why I prefer Latinx, because Latin American folks call us a lot of names that we didn't ask for. Right? I like Latinx is fine, I think. So anyway, residing in the US, Latin American birth or descent, we're people that cross the border, have ancestors that cross the border, or the border crossed over them. The people that I work with in New Mexico, the border firmly crossed over them over a century and a half ago, right? And so they've been adjusting to life as a result of that border shift rather than having crossed the borders. Now, something that I think is really, really important, it can't be understated, but I also don't want it to be confused. I used to say that Spanish is the central piece of this, right? And it is, but only sort of historically and on an ongoing basis as Spanish begins to fade for folks who've been here for some time or have been here for multiple generations. Our historical trajectories are shaped by Spanish speakers, right? Whether it's a second generation person whose parents shaped the way that they see the world, shaped the way that they see Latinx cultures, right? And the people that they're most likely to talk to, right? Or your family hasn't spoken Spanish in 5 generations, but that has shaped the way that you see the world and shape the way that you understand your own culture. So our historical trajectories are shaped by Spanish speakers. We all have been, we've all undergone similar colonial dynamics, right? With African enslavement, indigenous enslavement, and the creation of a permanent indigenous underclass, right? We have very marks from those same colonial dynamics all across Latin America, and we're all meeting in the middle here in the United States. A couple of really fun examples that I like to bring up is the many faces of the African, the Yoruban god Shango. One of his faces is the Catholic Saint Santa Barbara, right? That's his Catholic avatar. Obviously, for most of you probably in the audience, know that Shango used to have to hide behind this avatar, live within this avatar, kind of like a nested Russian doll, right? In order for enslaved African folks to be able to practice the old religion. Now, precisely the same is in the case of Central Mexico, with Nahuatl speakers, members of the Aztec Triple Alliance, and the groups on their periphery, and that they revered a goddess known as Tonantzin Coatlicue. Tonantzin is the Virgin. If you know the story of Juan Diego and the Virgin of Guadalupe, they're one and the same, right? In fact, many of us as researchers and academics now believe that there are many folks that upon the arrival of the Spanish in Mexico thought, well, clearly this Virgin is a Tonantzin because they have such similar sort of stories, right? So there's these sort of avatars all over the place, and that's a pretty good example of similar colonial dynamics varying marks from one culture to another. And then finally, there's the Latinidad in the United States is shaped in no small part by non-Latinx dynamics. Now, that's not just white folks and Latinx folks and the power imbalance there, although that's a big part of it, but also how we've been influenced by African-American folks, Black folks in the United States, how we've been influenced by indigenous folks in the United States. Our notions of indigeneity in the United States among Latinx folks and increasingly across Latin America are being shaped by federally recognized tribes in the United States and their members. And that's a conversation that we can have after this talk is done too. So the next couple of slides are slides that I haven't presented before. It's how I'm adding to my research a little bit. Another reason I'm really excited to present this in this venue today. So just really quick quickly to add a little bit more texture to my understanding to the understanding that I'm trying to present to you of what Latinidad is. I want you to think a little bit about race in historical Latin America, race, ethnicity, class, and how slippery race, ethnicity, and class were in Latin America, could be in Latin America, particularly as you move a little bit away from the cities and rural areas like New Mexico that I study, and many others, right? So we've been kind of prepared, we've been kind of groomed for this life as Latinx folks in the United States, and that should be clear in a second. So in terms of ethnicities, indigenous and African folks from the beginning have always, almost from the beginning of colonial Latin American history, have had a little bit of freedom, right? Especially in rural areas, to slide into one ethnic group or another. Europeans had less reason to do so, being on top of things in terms of in socioeconomic terms. But a good example is my own folks. Like I said, I'm Dominican. My own folks in DR, right? There are many folks who are who bear strong African phenotype, but who tap their indigenous roots, right, rather than their Black African roots, in order to reclaim historical cultures, right? And that's been happening for a long time. That's centuries in the making in the DR, right, which confuses people in the United States quite a bit. Another example common to much of Latin America, and one that I think most of you are familiar with already, indigenous and mestiço folks becoming European or whitening themselves from one generation to the next as they work their way up by marriage, or economically or whatever. And we've got some pretty fantastic examples of that in New Mexico, where people who are classified as Indio when they're born or baptized as Indians become Españoles once they become rich on the periphery in northern New Mexico. So this is the historical Latin American picture, which has sort of prepared us or groomed us for what comes in the United States, because what comes in the United States which is, I think, the opposite of what people tend to imagine, that Latinidad in the United States draws Black and indigenous folks toward whiteness. I would argue the opposite, right? If my computer will allow me to get to the next slide. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Ian Lara. If you're not, he's hilarious, an Afro-Dominican comedian who, as a Dominican, has come sort of full circle in identifying as Black or Afro-Dominican in the United States, something that in the Dominican Republic, it's literally dangerous to do, because violence can emerge if you make those claims to Blackness or Africanness afterwards. Things are changing in DR, but not very quickly. Another good example of rolling back to indigeneity, right, is the Aztec dance community across the United States, which is thousands and thousands of people deep, including my wife has practiced Aztec dance. My kids have witnessed and practiced to a lesser degree Aztec dance. People rolling back in that sort of way. And that's a positive development as far as I'm concerned, and influenced by indigenous communities and their pride and empowerment here in the United States, influenced by African Americans and their pride and empowerment in the United States. Now, the flip side to this, right, is that European descended and white identified folks, might be the better way to put it, Latinx folks, can also slip into these other categories in the United States too, which I don't think is necessarily unwelcome. I welcome the idea that they look back into their genealogies, they look back into their histories and understand, you know, who they're connected to as well. The thing is, we got to be aware of, and when it comes to white identified Latinx folks, is that they can always roll back to being white at any moment too, even in the same day, right? Where they might get better treatment, you know, at the gas station or something, you know, because they're white identified, even though they might identify as indigenous. So it's something that we have to keep in mind. So now I know what I've presented to you, this totally wild map now, right? But I promise when I write this up, it'll be multiple different maps of Latinidad, right? The cross-cutting themes of this talk, and I know we're pretty deeply into the talk already. Like I said, the case studies will just be about 5 or 6 minutes a piece. Things that I'm interested in, things I call heritage Latinidad and cultural trophies, right? When Latinx artifacts and architecture become trophies of the American white folks, or Americans more generally, around non-Latinx Americans more generally, that live around them or now live in places where Latinx folks used to live. And I'll give you a couple examples of that, which I find really interesting. Like I mentioned earlier, Latinx, non-Latinx power dynamics is really important to me too, understanding that. A theoretical concept that is not my own. I know it's a totally wild sounding term, right? Latinxtopia, it's not my term. The idea that when there's a critical mass of diversity among Latinx groups in places like, say, Miami is a great example, a total Latinxtopia with people of one Latinx subgroup, an ethnicity, a national heritage, whatever, can support other Latinx folks in identifying as a member of a different group. An example of that is Botanicas. American Botanicas support all national origin Latinx folks, right? By bringing all of their national ethnic items to the table. That's a perfect example of a Latinxtopia, and I love the concept and the term. Also the term gentification, if you've seen the show, it's a great show. I think it's off the air now. It's really sad. It's only on for a few years. I promise you that many of us have been writing about and thinking about gentification before the show Gentified came to be. Gentification just means when Latinx folks go off, become worldly, or make a bunch of money, or get college educated or whatever, and come back to their home communities, right, in the United States, and change those communities as a result. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's horchata boba tea, right, which may or may not be good. To be fair, I haven't had it, but it sounds really scary to me, right? You know, maybe more than all of these, I think if you can take any message from this, if you're faculty here, if you teach K-12, is the power of Latinx archaeology in the K-12 and college classroom, which I'll talk about in the context of Latin experimental archaeology. A lot of terms, a lot of new terms, half of them you haven't heard before, but if you want a copy of this presentation, I'm happy to give it to anyone who wants. There's no quiz afterwards, you don't have to worry about. These are my sites and work locations: California, northern New Mexico, central and southern Florida, although I've done a little bit of work in New Orleans and New York too, which have played a role in shaping my mind on these things. The first example is that of Victorian Latinidad in 19th century Oakland, about 10 miles north of where I'm at. This, sorry, I don't know if you're seeing my little pointer as I am. It's pretty choppy right now. I apologize for that. Excuse me. So this adobe that I mentioned earlier is now a storage area. It looks a little bit different than this early 20th century or mid 20th century image. It's a storage area, a storage shed in a park called Diamond Park. And Diamond Park is a park that's surrounded by a somewhat relatively wealthy neighborhood. It's a gentrified neighborhood, but relatively wealthy one in Oakland, right? And it's this amenity, right? So many adobes, so many Latinx and indigenous produced adobe structures in California are neighborhood amenities, community amenities, and largely white sort of communities, which this is. And it has a history where it's been an amenity. This thing was built as an amenity on literally on the labor of historical Latinx folks. So in 1897, the bricks that this is made up of were dismantled from an earlier ruin, an early 19th century ruin that was the central home of the Peralta family. The Peralta family, the state of things in California in the 19th century with Latinx folks versus indigenous folks, people we call Latinx are Mexican American or Chicano or Chicanx, right? In that context, were pretty wealthy, relatively compared to their indigenous neighbors, right? So it comes from their vast sort of property. They're acquired by an American incoming white guy named Dennis Diamond, right? And he used these bricks from the adobe ruin, which he presumably purchased from the Peralta family and took a few miles away to build a playhouse for his kids, right? Like, talk about an amenity, and talk about, you know, as we'd understand it in contemporary terms, disrespect, right? But in his mind, it's probably, you might have guessed it, an homage, right? Probably a love letter to Latinx or Chicano cultures that preceded him. He probably saw it that way. Later in the 20th century, I'm not trying to be fair here, to be honest. There's really no way to be fair in judging this. So later in the 20th century, though, Diamond sold that property for it to be used by the Boy Scouts. He sold it to the Boy Scouts of America. They used this as a meeting house. And when the kids would camp out there, the Boy Scout kids, it'd be surrounded by playtime teepees. They would literally be replicating the colonial relationship between Latinx folks and the indigenous folks that were slowly transitioning into a Latinx or Mexican American sort of lifeway. It reminds me a lot of this park in Denver that I know of, this kids park in Denver, playground, called Bear Creek Park. You can see this, what's a sleeping cowboy now, what used to be a kind of inundated statue of a sleeping Mexican, right? Like the sleeping Mexican, which they built, you know, with their own hands in the 70s, like on purpose, you know. The sleeping Mexican is a pretty offensive sort of icon to Mexican Americans and Mexican folks. So many Mexican folks sort of more generally, they turned it into a cowboy by messing with the hat a little bit, changing the boots and putting jeans on the guy. But it reminds me of that, where Latinidad is a cultural sort of amenity. right? Now, what do we do with the adobe storage unit? The long and short of this is that we study the adobe bricks there to get a sense for just how much power the Peralta family had in terms of marshaling labor, most of that being indigenous labor, right? And architectural energetics is just reconstructing or reverse engineering, rather, the methods by which they built not the storage unit, the storage house, although that's part of it, right? But the houses that they built in the Peralta property several miles away, right? And that gives me a sense for the relationship between Latinx folks and non-Latinx folks, indigenous Ohlone folks, in that period, right? Another place that it gets me to is understanding that phenotype, as coded in those times, was not only on your skin. It was not only how your nose was shaped, how your eyes are shaped, and the color of your hair, right? Phenotype then was also in mud and wood. And you can probably make some analogs to today, let's say lowriders and lowrider bikes, for example, as being signs of Latinidad or signs of Mexicanism or Mexican heritage, right? I believe that phenotype was identified in wood and mud here is pretty clear, because Americans coming in were building Victorians like the one that you see on your right, which became the Peralta house. So there's an artist, an LA-based artist, Los Angeles, named Rafa Esparza. I encourage you to look up Rafa. He's a fantastic, amazing artist whose primary medium is mud. He paints on mud, does other things with mud, but he has this great description for adobe, that adobe bricks are loaded with meaning, that they signify brownness, the land, and labor, and he wants them to signify that. He's making that purposeful connection, that purposeful index. And the Peralta family, I argue, was aware of this connection. They did not want to be associated with brownness, the labor, land, indigeneity, right? Thus, this Victorian that they built around the 1890s, right, the same time Diamond acquires those bricks, is a gentification, an historical gentification, as I see it. So the next case study that we'll be talking about, and I know it's a whirlwind of case studies here, takes place in Taos, New Mexico, where I've spent most of the last 17 summers of my life working on largely the same site, which is an old whiskey distillery and grist mill site called Turley's Mill. So Turley's Mill is an enormous site. For the region, there's almost nothing like it, truly, even to this day. There aren't many structures that are this big in the valley of Taos in northern New Mexico. 135 by 50 meters. If you don't know metric, those are roughly yards, right? To give you a better sense for the size, that is the size of a standard American football field. The first story is stone masonry. The second story is adobe brick. And this is a nice image of what the stone masonry first story sort of looks like. Some of those standing stone masonry walls are still about 14 feet off the visible surface. Enormous structure, big as a Walmart, right? You can see the adobe second story here. These walls are a meter thick, the ones that are visible. We uncovered some that are 2 meters thick, still buried underground. Why so thick? 6 feet thick is anybody's guess. The meter thick walls, it makes sense, but the others don't quite so much. It was operating between the 1830s and 1840s and was destroyed in 1847 by a coalition of Mexican and indigenous warriors, about 500 of them, who laid siege to the place for 2 days, killed every person inside. Every person, to be clear, was white inside and American. Right, killed every person inside and set the place on fire, and do not appear to have looted a thing after they left, based on the estate sale records that we have. The historiography of this place, that's how historians interpret this time, this period, and this event, is, I call it bewildered. They're befuddled. They're like, but Turley, the person the American who came in and started this mill, funded the construction of this mill, and Turley brought jobs, right? Turley brought jobs. He brought industry. Why would they be unhappy with him, right? So I'm trying to change that history a little bit, right? So as I mentioned, in 1847, there was a rebellion against American occupation. They had just come in, they had just occupied the Southwest in 1846. Turley and his mill had been there for about 15 years prior to that. In that rebellion, a group of 1,500 rebels, Mexican and Indian both, right, targeted the U.S. governor, the New Mexican governor, U.S. appointed New Mexican governor, scalped him in the town of Taos, and then rode 12 miles north to my mill, again, laid siege to the place, killed everyone inside, just about everyone. One person was left alive who got away, and set the place on fire afterwards. The historiographical stereotype is that this is a result of conspiring Mexicans, unappreciative of American innovations, and drunk Indians who just wanted whiskey. But like I said, they appear to have taken almost nothing. They would be the world's worst looters. I believe this is something different. I have a question that I ask, the primary question that I ask that's funded, the research to answer this question that's funded by the National Science Foundation is, why would they attack Turley's Mill, right? What are the resource and culture-based reasons for this? I can't start I'm a scientist, I can't start my research with racist understanding, right? The drunken Indian and the conspiring Mexican, right? My question is, the industrial writing on the wall, right? Did folks who worked at the mill encounter the same thing that everywhere else there's an industrial revolution prior to this in the world? The American Northeast, Europe, parts of Asia, right? Did many of them encounter the same thing as so many others, right? There are differences in construction. Before that, the only place you would build that is this big is a church, an adobe church. We go from the sacred to the profane. There are changes in industrial time and the nature of work. People were sheep herders before this. People were pastoralists before this. People were farmers. People grew wheat before this. Life was very different, not as regimented as they would be in an industrial context, right? And resource use is another question. Does this place use more resources, more than its allotted resources? That question is complex, but he would have had a definite sort of allotment. And that's a conversation we can have another time. So did they do the same things that folks did from India to England to New York and Boston when they first encountered industry? Did they carry out machine sabotage, full-scale rebellion? Is this that kind of rebellion is the question. How do I figure it out? Well, the main thing that I need to get at is how many people it took to build this place and how many people it took to run this place on a day-to-day sort of basis. And diagnostic artifacts like this machine bushing, it's called a bushing, it's a machine part, right, can tell me that. We find multiple of these bushings broken in the same pattern. That pattern will tell us something about the amount of torque that bushing took and something about the machines that surrounded it and how many people it would have taken to run those machines. The more people that would have worked at the site or would have taken to build the site, the more chisme, that means gossip for those of you who don't know, the tea, right? The more tea there would have been spilling all over the Taos Valley. My estimates to this point, based on diagnostic artifacts and architecture, is construction would have taken between 80 and 150 people to pull off, day-to-day labor, at least 40 people to pull off. In a valley where the population is 2,000, in social network analysis numbers, those are significant, right? So the rest is sort of math. How many people are hearing about this place? How many people feel that the writing is on the wall and that they need to teach the Americans that they can't do this here, right? Okay, Latinx experimental archaeology. This I'll run through in just a few minutes. This is just sort of something that I've added to the presentation that I want you to see. I study these ovens in New Mexico and California, these mud brick hornos in New Mexico and California. This is a full-size one. They're about almost 6 feet in height, some of the bigger ones, right? Between 4.5 and 6 feet in height, depending on what your purpose is and where they're at. These are small ones that we make in my lab using bricks that are this size. I hope you can see this. I'm making a total mess with the dry mud that's falling off all on top of my computer here. But these are ones we're trying to emulate. The reason that we're trying to emulate them is because initially we were curious. In archaeological terms, in the Southwest and Far West, we don't find many hornos, right? So if hornos were so common, there should be, for every 4 or 5 houses, there should be at least 1 or 2 common hornos. Why don't we find them, right? The number of articles that mention hornos and describe the anatomy of an horno archaeologically are practically nil across the West. So our question is there a signature, and can we find that out using experimental archaeology? In order to do that, you have to know what parts of this are most important to the people that use them. I happen to know a lot of people who actually use them today, and what users value more than anything is the heat. How well these things hold heat, because you fill it up with wood fuel, right? You light that stuff on fire, you let it burn for a little bit, but typically what you do afterwards is take the fuel out, and the heat that remains in the walls, that's what cooks the food. Some people leave some little crumbs in there, some little coals in there to retain some of the heat, but in many cases, all of it's taken out. It's even mopped up with a wet mop, right, in order to clean off the dust, the ash from the floor. Right? So the heat is most important. So what we do is we play with different additive variables, right? What you put in the mud, straw, gravel, et cetera, et cetera. And the gravel that we use is aquarium gravel, right? Because it comes in a standard size, shape, and most of it comes from one quarry in Texas. All of it across the US, I found out from somebody I know in that industry, right? We build these little adobe ovens and we put thermocouple probes in them. We fill them up with thermometers and we follow the heating cycle. We heat it up to a particular number of degrees, and then we cut off the heat, we cap it up, and we watch the heat go down, right? The additive type that holds heat longest wins. So far, we found that it's gravel, and that surprised everyone, but we need many, many more go-rounds of this. So what we'd like to do is turn this into a kind of citizen science project. For some reason, it's not going to the next slide. Ah, there we go. Okay. We turn this into a citizen science project. My students help me to build them like bricks, but we want to enlist the help of other college courses, other college classes, colleges, outside of my own, right? We want to export this to K-12 classrooms, export this to retirement communities so they can put their own additive types in that we prescribe, right, to test, to get a sense for how well their ovens hold heat. And if you see the joy on these students' faces, this is not a staged photo. I stage a lot of photos in my business for my website and for other materials. This is not a staged photo. It is pure joy. What came from this research is we started to realize that Adobe draws people together. For those of you of Mexican background in the audience, this is a lot like a tamalada, right? Where people make tamales as a group. Most of what goes on here is chisme. Most of what goes on is gossip and joy and laughter, right? Which is pretty amazing. And I've experienced this in northern New Mexico in helping to construct adobe structures. There's a reason that people do it, and it's not only so that they can have a shelter over their heads. So I'll walk you real quick through the steps. This is how we build a foundation and walls. We put these on small garden carts, and we put these ultralight camp stoves inside them so we can get consistent heat. That's how we build the foundation and the walls. We go from the walls to the dome, right, which we carefully place these bricks, into a dome form. And I have an article that'll be coming out in the next probably 4 or 5 months or so. I assume that has the recipe, the formula for putting all of this together, so you can do it on your own at your home or with your students, K-12 or college. And then we plaster it over, and we put a little Red Bull pan in there because that is the mold for the exhaust. Right. And this is what they look like in the end. They're about 50 by 50 centimeters. We put little kind of ugly little wooden doors in front of them, rustic. That's a better term. Rustic wooden doors. And then we let it rip. This is one of my students who is Latina and Yaqui, by the way, kind of illustrating my point about indigenous Latinidad as I see it. And this is what it looks like when we've attached the little propane tanks to it and let it rip. Okay, finally, getting to Florida, finally. Let me see how much time I have left. I want to make sure I don't go too late here, give you time for questions. Okay, so el otro trabajo, living objects of the Latinx occult. So I've worked in California's East Bay on this, and also in Orange County, in Orlando, and various cities. In Broward, like I said, I've got family in Broward and in Orlando, and this project just in the past has kept me busy while I'm there, and I've done it with some family members, including my mom. My mom has come into me with multiple botanicas. For those of you who don't know what a botanica is, I call it the original Latinx safe space, right? It's a retail sales space, but it's a house for spiritual practitioners, right? Spiritual practitioners sell their wares there, and they come from many traditions, not only Santeria, but various other Caribbean traditions, various Mexican and Central American traditions, and to a lesser degree, some South American traditions as well. Their primary work here, they call trabajos. Trabajo just means work or job, right? But in this case, it's something more like prescription, right? The work that leads to a prescription. But it's not only a prescription about physical healing, but also about mental and emotional healing. It's about controlling one's circumstances, right? And these are various of the icons, emblems, and statuettes that you see there. If you don't know who that is on the left, that's the figure of Santa Muerte, who's somewhere between the Grim Reaper and the Virgin Mary in terms of symbolism. This is the Yoruban god Shango. Real quickly, I'm going to grab my Santa Barbara Africana here. I don't know if you can read that because I can't see myself here. You can see that somebody added that. This is originally a probably Chinese-made statue of Madonna and Child, but someone painted it, and these images clearly they're made to appear as Black figures, right? Black African figures. And if you look really closely, which you can't through the camera, you'll see that Santa Barbara, Shango's avatar, right? Catholic avatar, has a couple of scars on her face that someone cut into it, seemingly emulating Yoruban scarification ritual. And this is San Simon here to the right, which is Central American and Southern Mexican folk saint. They all have their different stories. All of these icons, these statues, and figures have their local lores, their regional stories, their regional legends, right? And in the United States, what's really special about U.S. Botanicas, because Botanicas are all over the Americas, right? What's special about U.S. Botanicas is that they bring them all together, right? It really parallels our experience as Latinx folks in the United States. Think about yourself, for example, those of you who are Latinx, right? And if you're not, just put yourself in our minds, right? Say you're of Mexican or Dominican or strictly Argentinian background. You walk into a botanica that has all these different things, so foreign to you, these things. You go in the botanica enough times and become comfortable, you start picking up on items that previously you've never heard of, because maybe the practitioner or a friend or another customer, right, says something about their power, right? Imagine if you're an Argentinian walking in and finally you adopt the Mexican folk saint Santa Muerte. That's real cultural crossover, right? That's real cultural braiding or blending, right? The same can be said of Afro-Caribbean saints and gods in the hands of Mexican Americans, where in Mexico there has been a hugely, for centuries, right, a hugely anti-Black sentiment, right? Adopting those figures into your life as a Mexican person, right, is something that you probably wouldn't have done, right, in Tijuana, Sinaloa, wherever, right? Very unlikely. So they connect to various Latin American traditions and bring them all sort of together. This is what the interior of a botanica looks like. What I find really interesting, conversation for another time, is that in the front is mostly stuff that if you see from the outside appears acceptable Catholic stuff, lots of white figures. But if you look in the back, the lesser known folk saints and Orisha or Santeria god images are kind of in the back, which I find interesting. A little bit racist, but you know, it's the order of these things, right? So my students and I, we walk through these places and we document what we see on the shelves. To try to make this a long and short, we ask the question of, do botanicas encourage intra-Latinx cultural exchange, right? So we think about item frequency. This is archaeology. It's an archaeology of the contemporary world. Item frequency and proportional wall space in terms of these materials. And we also think about Latinx populations and Latinx foreign-born populations in the neighborhoods where these shops are at, to the best of our ability in terms of gathering those data. That isn't available for every neighborhood. It is to an extent in various neighborhoods in Fort Lauderdale and Oakland, which is where I primarily worked on this. And what we found, I'll give you our findings real quickly. In Florida, Afro-Caribbean figures like this one, right, whose avatar is San Lázaro, are proportional to the number of the Afro-Caribbean or more general Caribbean population, roughly as far as we can tell. In California, Afro-Caribbean materials are greatly overrepresented, which is really interesting, really cool, and is a huge sign of crossover to incorporating Santeria practice with curanderismo, which is what's popular in Mexican and Central American cultures, right? In Florida, San Simon, which is, like I said, a Central American saint, is relatively proportional to Central American population. I was actually a little surprised to find that. And in California, it's a little bit overrepresented, indicating some cultural crossover. Santa Muerte in Florida, and where it says Mexico there is its origin, right? So in Florida is way overrepresented, or at least when I did this research about 6 or 7 years ago I walked into a botanica, a Florida botanica, very small one. I forgot where in Fort Lauderdale, where it looked like about 70% of the shelves, figurine shelves, were dedicated to Santa Muerte, a central Mexican folk saint, when the number of Mexican origin people in that area was very small in comparison. Santa Muerte has the biggest crossover, perhaps, of any of these sort of folk saints. As you might expect, it's proportional in Mexico. Now, real quickly, the future directions of the research. I used to joke and say Latinx is in space, but that was before the Andor, Ahsoka, and Mandalorian series were deeply in space now. So In terms of the Oakland work, we're writing that up now with an engineer here at my university, and we're working on dismantling the Oakland adobe to bring it back to the Peralta Park where it belongs, and probably bring in some artists to do something creative and meaningful with those materials, so it's no longer a trophy, right? In Taos, we're working on completing our NSF project right now. I'm the lead on that, and I'm finishing that up, and I should be writing it up literally in the next 6 weeks, and I have students working on an exhibition for that now. The Botanica work has become a traveling museum exhibition, which is in addition to our museum, been at a couple of others in the Bay Area so far. If you're interested and you're in Florida, we could probably work out a way to get these materials there and to get my students there to help you set it up. Ultimately, this idea of Latinx as coalition is academic work, and what I'm increasingly pushing these days, and what I will be pushing through my book, but also it's political work. It's very, very important political work. As much as Latinx can be a coalition for analysis, right? Latinx can be a coalition in terms of politics. And right now in places like Texas and Florida, that's not working out. So I hope to see something a little bit more unified in the future in both directions. So that's what I've got. And these are the people that I have to thank, especially the NSF, who gave me a bunch of money to work in New Mexico. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Albert. This has been a fantastic presentation. I enjoy, as a Star Wars fan, I really, really enjoyed that ending with Latinx in space. I am not up to date with Ahsoka, but trust me, that's in my to-do list tonight. uh, but yeah, now if anybody in the audience has any questions that want to write it on the chat or that want to unmute themselves, please feel free to do either way. In the meantime, then I had a question, and it was about how long ago did you started the work on the botanicas, and what was the thing that shocked you the most when you worked in Florida with the botanicas,
That shocked me the most?
or
Oh,
surprised you the most?
oh, sure. Yeah, no, there are definitely some shocks, for sure. So I started that work around 12 years ago in New York, when I was at Columbia. And I was visiting various botanicas, and it was just fun for me, and just picking up some things here and there, some items here and there, because I just love material culture, right? And getting to know folks. And then I started to realize that in listening to folk conversations in botanicas, when I hear their questions that they're asking practitioners and one customer asking another, they're clearly entrees into these various cultures, right? So you'll have, for example, a made-up example. You might have, someone from Peru who's talking to someone from Cuba about Santeria practice, and it's like, those are conversations that, were it not for the Botanica, might not ever have existed, right? The places like Botanicas are like factories for Latinx folks, right? Like they just spit out Latinx folks, right? American Latinx, which I think is fascinating. That's the most fascinating thing I saw. The most shocking things were how the powerful rituals that I saw taking place right in front of me, kind of out in the open. Like some botanicas have backspace where they take people back there to do various rituals or trabajos or cleanses or whatever. Some don't, and some just do it right there in front of the world. And the power, the ecstatic trance and emotional states I saw people in, that was really, shock is definitely the right word for how it felt at first. And then pure fascination, and then guilt afterwards, because many of the rituals that take place there, people are wanting to control aspects of their lives that are really painful, and so I was kind of shocked and fascinated, kind of like, oh my God, at first, and then I realized, later as I'm observing, that these are meaningful and sometimes really difficult moments in people's lives. And so when I've gone in with my students, now having done this for a little longer, at that point, 5 or 6 years into it, when I take my students in, if we see a ritual taking place, we're done and we leave. Even if the practitioner doesn't mind us being there, I feel too intrusive. So yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I guess another good question that I know people have, I have talked about this with other people in the past is, and that I wanted to get your perspective on this is, how do you envision Latinx archaeology in the future? Do you believe that at some point we will have a subdiscipline of Latinx archaeology, or maybe a coalition of Latinx archaeologists? Like, how can we marry Latinx archaeologists into the political and advocate work that many of us are trying to do?
Well, so you have me thinking in asking that question about the term BIPOC, because it's really important that we think and analyze the term BIPOC when we think about why there is no Latinx archaeology, why there is no coalition of Latinx archaeologists in the SAA or any other organization that I know of, right? That's formal, there is no BILPOC, right? Which I think is interesting, right? So the BI and BIPOC, of course, represent the folks that, for lack of a better term right now, have been most marginalized in U.S. history, right? At least that's the way the BIPOC term appears to present it. Latinx folks are considered part of the POC, right? The people of color. And if we don't identify strictly as Black or Indigenous, which some of us do, but certainly not all of us, right? We have to divorce ourselves from Latinx in order to be part of that, for folks to consider as part of a group that's been relatively marginalized to a greater degree than the rest of the POC, right? White identified folks, Asian American folks, and so on, right? Like there's no BILPOC, right? So right now in archaeology, there are tons, and I'm not opposed to them. I love them, and I love the people that are working in them. I know them. I know most of them, right? Working on Black and Indigenous issues in archaeology, and forming Black and Indigenous coalitions in archaeology, and even Black and Indigenous archaeological practitioners groups working together on various publications and various presentations and venues. And there have been Latinx folks that have been part of that, both on the Black side and the Indigenous side, right? But there has been no outreach, no extension, nothing whatsoever to Latinx folks in archaeology at all, right? I think that's an enormous shortcoming, not only of the BIPOC terminology, but of how that translates in archaeology, right? The way that I put it is that when people ask me what it means to be Latinx, my nutshell is that there are many ways to be Black, and Latinx is one of them. There are many ways to be Indigenous, and Latinx is one of them, because my background is both Black and Indigenous. But I don't feel entirely comfortable joining, say, the Society for Black Archaeologists, right? Or the Society, I forgot the name of that. I should know the name of the Indigenous archaeology. I think it's the Indigenous Archaeology Collective, IAC. I don't feel comfortable joining either as a person who identifies as Latinx, despite having both those backgrounds, right? And so I think that we need to start thinking in BILPOC terms, although it sounds so gross when you call it BILPOC, but we need to start thinking about Latinx as a comparatively marginalized group, along with Black and Indigenous folks, and remembering that there's overlap, right? I've talked to a number of Latinx archaeologists over the years about forming such a Latinx group, but it's never gained ground or gained steam. And I think that right now our political context is such that Latinx is increasingly associated with whiteness these days, right? And it's not a place that anybody wants to be in this political moment in archaeology. But when when the dust settles, because it will settle, Latinx folks will still be here. We will still be Black and brown, and so it's time to get serious, about this. And I'm really glad to see that various levels of public parks, national parks, state parks, various state parks have started to take Latinx archaeology and Hispanic heritage seriously, right? I'm not a fan of the term Hispanic, so Hispanic heritage and stuff, seriously, and that's great. But I think that we need like an SAA or SHA based coalition in order to finally start making things happen. I've been yelling Latinx archaeology from the rooftops the last 12 years, 13 years, and it hardly exists. I can't do it alone. And Ruben Mendoza, I should give a shout out to Ruben Mendoza since this is being recorded, to be fair. Ruben too. Please Google it and look him up.
Will do. Thank you so much. And I see that we have two other questions. I know we're running out of time, but we're going to try to answer them both. So the first question is from Adam Knight, and he wrote on the comments, at historic sites of Spanish colonial settlements in the US, where and how does Latinx heritage start and Spanish Iberian diaspora heritage end? Or does it?
Thank you for the impossible question, Adam. Whoever you are, I don't think we know each other, but literally impossible to answer. But I'll do the best that I can. So I think those sites certainly qualify as part of Latinx heritage, right? But I think that in terms of understanding Latinx heritage generally in the United States, I think that it's important first because of the political moment. The political moment is Black and Indigenous right now, and there's no way around that at the moment. Maybe 10 years from now, things will be different, right? But to center Black and Indigenous experiences in those colonial endeavors, by virtue of them being colonial, there almost have to be Black and Indigenous. There have to be, it's not almost, there have to be Black and Indigenous components of them, even if they may appear remote, or even if they haven't been interpreted that way in the past, like Spanish colonial presidios and missions and so on. It wasn't just friars, it wasn't just Spanish soldiers. The other thing to think about is in this colonial context, in particular in the American Southwest and Far West, the number of actual Spaniards who existed in these places at any one time was really never in any of these places in any one particular region larger than you can count on two hands, like actual peninsulares or criollos, like in real life. Them like being there and being purely Spanish, that's a thing that doesn't really happen, right? There's something to be said for, no, there's nothing to be said for it. There's nothing to be said for it. That's a thing that just doesn't really happen in real life back then, right? The interesting thing is that, from my perspective, working in the Far West and Southwest, like the colonizer populations relocated Indians, right? Relocated Indians, relocated formerly enslaved, Black African folks with just a pinch of folks who are mixed or who are criollos. Right? I mean, even in the Southwest, the so-called last conquistador, Oñate, was a descendant of Moctezuma, right? I mean, like, even conquistadors are descended of Moctezuma, right? So this is all, Latinx material. I think we have to take a deep, hard look at the way we interpret these colonial parties and start to reckon with that as Latinx folks and as folks who analyze Latinx and colonial era materials, particularly in what's now the United States. Much of the rest of Latin America differs by place and by time. I want to be clear about that, but I focus on Latinx heritage sites in the United States. Yeah, so it's like, I don't think it ends, and I'm not even sure the Spanish-Iberian diaspora piece is like super accurate, even in those colonial circumstances, right? Look through the roles of soldiers, and besides like 1521, right? Like how many by the 17th century were purely Spaniard, soldiers arriving fresh from the peninsula by the 17th and 18th and so on centuries. I mean, it's not many. You're not really looking at a Spanish or Iberian colonial situation, right? So relocated Indians. I think it's funny. I know I got 1 minute left and I'm still answering your question. I'm sorry, but I love the question. It's funny that when we think about, let's pull back to Inca, for example, right? Inca, the Inca powers relocated, tens of thousands of indigenous folks from one place to another, right? In many contexts, you could consider those relocations fully colonial because there's already people in the places that they're sending them off to. But do we ever say that any of them are not Indians, right? When we look back and think about the Inca imperial practices, right, in that way, demographic practices, right? Like, do we ever look back and think, well, they're not really native, there are indigenous people. They're just indigenous people that were forced to move around, right? Or chose to move around, or both, right? And I think in the colonial Spanish or Iberian colonial context, it's more indigenous and Black than we might think. Students are always shocked when they hear me say I forget what the number is, 10 or 12% of the colonial population of Los Angeles was Black. They're like, what? How can that be? What do you mean? I thought they were Spanish colonists, right? I mean, they might have called themselves Españoles, but it's not exactly what they thought or what we think. Anyway, it's 1 o'clock my time now, so I guess I should zip up.
No worries. I think if it's okay with you, Albert, Renee has a question, and that can be the last question for today. Yeah. Renee, do you want to unmute yourself and go ahead?
Definitely, if y'all can hear me. So just more than anything, kind of like a note, and a thank you, of course, for this presentation. Professor of mine, Dr. González Tennant, here at UTRGV in the Valley, recommended it and said a lot about, in our class today, said a lot about, the Latinos in archaeology specifically, and historical archaeology, the opportunity being there, but also, the need for more work. Appreciate your work. I'm from South Texas, the Rio Grande Valley, right? We call them Yerbedillas. A lot of interesting thing as far as like almost like the cyborg theory when you see some of the things that are being produced with like local curanderos with their faces on it, instead of like something from China, like you mentioned, being not necessarily co-opted but rebranded.
Yeah.
Just somebody, I don't know if they're in your network, but Danielle Lopez, she's up at UTSA. She's been doing a lot of work around curanderismo, and she should be getting her doctorates and defending soon. So that might be something else that could be intersectional. But more than anything, just kind of a thank you, especially as I'm finishing up graduate and getting more into historical archaeology through GIS and mapping. Really the lack of what you kind of see as far as Latinos and the kind of focused products in archaeology in the United States, at least. But yeah, great to hear this. I'll probably be emailing you just with the follow-up.
Please email. Yes, please email. And tell Ed I said hi. Send him a que lo que for me. I don't know if you know what que lo que means, but Google that and then send him a que lo que.
Okay.
Okay. I'm so happy to hear from you. Please email me. It might take me a day or two to get to it, but I will answer the email. I love talking about this stuff, and we can set up a Zoom or whatever, and we can pick one another's brains. And please, your friend who works with curanderex folks, or curandere, depending on your perspective, send them my way too. I would love to talk. Like my research as far as the botanica stuff, it's for the time being, it's over, and it's been the product has been a rolling museum exhibit. I'll write it up eventually, but the research side is over. But we learned so much that I'm not going to write about, that I would just love to like fill someone else's brain with, so they can, so it's not just something that people find in my papers when I die. Like I would really love for that to be the case, and I'd love to meet you. Thank you for that. Before we all break, though, I do want to say what's up to Dave Scheidecker. Just shout out to Dave, Seminole Tipo. Good to see you here. Thank you for coming. And thanks to the rest of you for showing up today. I really appreciate it. I'm so happy to have had the opportunity to present this updated material.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. González. It has been an honor to have you as our first guest. And I think I said at the beginning, and I say it again, it was the perfect way to begin, all of the celebrations that are going to be happening in the US with National Hispanic Heritage Month, but also to kick off our very first Honrando Nuestra Historia series of events. So thank you so much for sharing all of your incredible knowledge and wisdom. I am forever grateful that you agreed to teach us about all of your amazing work with Latinidad and Excavating Latinx material culture. So everybody, I will see you in our upcoming virtual Cafecito lectures. If you haven't done so already, please go to fpan.us, where you can see all details of all of the events that we're going to be having, not only in person, but also remotely and bilingual. So thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you. Bye.